The Beekeeper of Lost Time, a chronicle of the forest's hungry shadow. In Philadelphia in the 1900s, there was a whispering of a man that lived with the bees. Not only did he live with them, he was almost one with them. They seemed to be an extension of his thoughts and what he wished to inflict onto others. He was rarely seen, yet always whispered about, a warning to children to not wander off too far. If they did, they may disappear deep into the trees where buzzing of thousands of bees lived with the man. There were many over the years that just thought this was just a dumb urban legend to keep children in line and make sure they didn't get lost in the forest. If anyone did ever encounter the man or the bees, they were too traumatized to ever speak of it. What could they have seen out there in the thick of the green tower of trees that kept secrets of the resident of the brush? In the shadow of the Industrial Revolution, while Philadelphia roared with the clatter of trolleys and the soot of steel mills, there existed a counter-silence in the deep, untamed woods of the Wissahickon Valley. The locals spoke of a man who existed not in the city's timeline, but in the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the timber. They called him the beekeeper, though keeper was perhaps too soft a term for a man who seemed to be a hive unto himself. He was a man rendered in shades of gray and ochre, his clothes stained with wax and propolis. It was rumored that if you stood downwind from his hidden enclave, you wouldn't smell the damp earth or decaying leaves. You would smell the sickening, cloying sweetness of ancient honey. The most terrifying aspect of the legend was not the man's face, but his proximity to his swarm. He did not merely tend to them, he moved with a singular, terrifying fluidity. When he walked through the thickets of towering, claustrophobic trees, the bees did not buzz around him, they moved with him, a living, vibrating shroud that obscured his features and acted as a psychic barrier. It was said that his thoughts were the bees' commands. If he felt anger, the swarm would surge outward, a dark cloud of collective malice, seeking the warmth of an intruder's breath. If he felt hunger, they would scatter into the valley, returning with the golden nectar of flowers that shouldn't have been blooming in the deep shade. The children of the 1910s and 1920s were raised on this folklore, a dark tether meant to keep them from the dangerous ravines. But the children who did vanish, the ones who wandered past the point where the city's ambient noise died, did not simply go missing. Those few who claimed to have seen the beekeeper and lived to carry the weight of the memory rarely spoke in sentences. They spoke of the green towers, the ancient gnarled oaks that seemed to bend inward to hide the man's cabin. They described sights that shattered their grasp on reality, nests built not of wax, but of human remnants, intertwined with honeycomb. They whispered of the buzzing sound itself, not a noise of wings, but a psychic vibration that felt like needles piercing their thoughts, forcing them to see the world through the compound eyes of the hive. The trauma of an encounter was never about the stings. It was about the loss of self. Those who drifted too close to the beekeeper returned with a terrifying, hollow quality to their eyes. They had seen the man not as a hermit, but as a vessel. They realized that he was the forest's way of pruning the intruders, a predatory immune system developed by the wilderness to protect its ancient hidden secrets. He was the ghost in the gears of the city, a reminder that just beyond the park's edge, civilization ends. There, in the thick of the green towers, the beekeeper waits. He is not a legend meant to keep children in line. He is an apex reality, tending a hive that does not just consume nectar, but consumes the very memories of those foolish enough to listen for the hum. If you are ever walking the trails of the Wissahickon and the air suddenly turns heavy, tasting of ozone and sugar. Do not look for the source, and for heaven's sake, do not answer the buzzing, because once you acknowledge him, you are no longer a visitor. You are an addition to his collection. The tree line doesn't just mark the end of the manicured lawn. It marks the boundary between the world we control and the world that controls us. Beyond that fringe of gnarled pines and grasping briars, the air changes. It grows heavy, static charged, and unnervingly still. If you've grown up in the valley, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know the story. You've likely felt the prickle on the back of your neck when the wind dies down and you're left standing too close to the dark. They call him the beekeeper. To talk about him is to invite the forest to lean in a little closer. The lore began, or so the town records suggest, in the early years of the 20th century. A man, or something occupying the shape of a man, settled into the deepest, most inaccessible sprawl of the timberland. He arrived with nothing but a veil, a smoker, and a singular obsessive purpose. He was a keeper of wings, a curator of the hive, but as the decades peeled away, the reality of his existence dissolved into something far more jagged, something that transformed from a local curiosity into a genuine waking nightmare. Human fear is not a static emotion. It is an evolving organism. The legend of the beekeeper didn't stay the same because our anxieties shifted with every passing generation. At first it was a warning for children. Stay clear of the deep woods, or the man with the humming cloak will add you to his collection. Parents didn't necessarily believe in ghosts, but they believed in the dangers of the wilderness. By attributing the risk to a mad beekeeper, they turned the vast, indifferent forest into a character, a villain with a face, a name, and a weakness. The stories grew teeth. They whispered of his appearance at the edge of our vision, a hulking silhouette draped in heavy canvas, his movements fluid and unnatural. They spoke of the swarms he commanded, clouds of insects that didn't behave like nature intended. They weren't gathering nectar, they were gathering intent. In the lore, these bees were not mere animals. They were his sensors, his reach, and his teeth. If you wandered too far, you wouldn't hear him coming. You would hear the vibration first, a low, rhythmic thrumming in your inner ear, a sound that bypassed the senses and went straight to the primal, reptilian brain. It is the sound of being hunted. If the legend had simply been about a man luring children into the brush, it would have faded by the mid-century, swallowed by the noise of modern life. But the beekeeper refused to be pinned down by a death certificate. There are persistent, chilling accounts, usually shared over cheap whiskey in backroad taverns, that claim he wasn't just a resident of the woods, but a resident of time itself. These stories suggest that the man was a fracture in reality. You might find his cabin, a structure that shouldn't exist because it isn't built on local land. It is built on a sliver of elsewhere. Inside that cabin, the air tastes like ozone and stale honey. It is a time capsule of horrors. Those who have claimed to stumble upon the site describe newspapers scattered across floorboards, some dated from the Great Depression, others from the late 80s, and some, perhaps most disturbingly, from years that have yet to come. The cabin is an anchor. It is the place where the timeline bleeds out. The bees are always gone in these accounts. The hives are empty, the comb is dry, and the wood is brittle with age. Yet the buzzing remains. It is the ghost of a sound, a lingering echo that refuses to dissipate, vibrating in the marrow of your bones. It suggests that the beekeeper is still there, moving through the seconds and minutes in ways we cannot perceive, watching us from the vantage point of a different epoch. What truly cements the beekeeper in our collective consciousness is the ambiguity. Was he a victim of his own solitude, a man whose psyche fractured under the weight of total isolation? Or was he something that arrived with the forest, a parasitic entity that donned a human suit to better understand how we tremble? The brilliance of the myth lies in its malleability. If you're a skeptic, he's a tragic figure, a lonely, misunderstood hermit who was driven to madness by the unforgiving silence of the trees. If you're a believer, he's something far more sinister, an apex predator that feeds on our collective vulnerability. He thrives on our tendency to fear the dark, feeding on the very stories we tell to keep him at bay. He is the personification of the unknown. He represents the reality that we are not the masters of the landscape. We are merely temporary visitors, and there are places in this world, places where paths vanish and the silence feels aggressive, that do not welcome us. The beekeeper is the shadow that stays when you turn on the light. If you find yourself walking near the tree line as the golden hour fades into the bruised purple of dusk, pay attention. If the birds suddenly go quiet, if the forest seems to hold its breath as if waiting for a curtain to rise, you are already too close, and if you hear it, that faint, rhythmic, metallic vibration that has no source, do not investigate. Do not follow the sound to see if it's a swarm or an engine or a trick of the wind. To follow the sound is to accept an invitation. It means you have acknowledged the legend, and in this world, acknowledgement is the only permission the darkness needs to claim you. The woods remember. They remember every version of him, every child who stumbled, every adult who hesitated, and every story that has been whispered into the campfire smoke. The beekeeper hasn't gone anywhere. He is just waiting for the next reader to find their way into his chapter. To understand why this legend persists, we have to look closer at the buzzing. It is never described as a swarm of insects in the traditional biological sense. Those who claim to have caught a glimpse of the phenomenon, usually those who barely escape the tree line, describe the sound as something far more mechanical. It's a rhythmic, oscillating drone, like an old radio stuck between stations, or the hum of high-voltage power lines buried just beneath the surface of the earth. There is a theory among local amateur historians that the beekeeper was never actually keeping bees at all. They posit that the hives were containers, prisons perhaps, or conduits for something that predates the forest itself. When the man moved into the woods in the early 1900s, he didn't bring honeybees. He brought a frequency. He brought a way for the forest to communicate with the things that exist in the in-between. This explains why the legend is so pervasive. It isn't a ghost story. It's a warning about resonance. When you walk into those woods, you are entering a space where the laws of physics are stretched thin. The beekeeper, in whatever form he takes, is simply the caretaker of that tension. He is the one who ensures the frequency doesn't break, the one who keeps the bees active so that the boundary between our reality and the hungry void remains thin enough to peek through. Let us dwell for a moment on the cabin. It is the most polarizing part of the lore. Skeptics argue it's nothing more than a ruined structure from a forgotten logging camp. Its decay, misinterpreted by overactive imaginations. But the physical evidence, if you believe the accounts, points to something much more distressing. There are stories of hunters who, seeking shelter from a sudden violent rainstorm, stumbled upon a weathered shanty that shouldn't have been there. They speak of the interior not as a room, but as a scrapbook of human existence. They claim the walls are lined with glass jars, but instead of honey, they contain scraps of paper, thousands of them. They are diary entries, handwritten letters, fragments of maps, and, as previously mentioned, news clippings. What makes these accounts truly maddening is the inconsistency of the contents. One hunter reported finding a letter addressed to his own grandfather, postmarked 3 years after his grandfather had passed away. Another claimed to find a photograph of himself, taken when he was a child, standing in front of a house he hadn't yet lived in. These are not merely objects. They are anchors for a man who is untethered from the linear progression of time. He isn't living in the woods. He is living in the entirety of the forest's history, simultaneously. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the beekeeper is his relationship with the local wildlife. Hunters and hikers who frequent the perimeter of the woods often note a strange phenomenon: the total absence of predators. You won't find wolves, bears, or mountain lions in the areas where the buzzing is said to be strongest. It is as if the creatures of the wild, guided by an instinct far more acute than our own, know better than to tread on the beekeeper's territory. Nature understands hierarchy. The forest has its own rules, and it seems that the beekeeper sits at the very top of that unspoken ladder. He is the master of the silence. When he is present, the woods don't just go quiet, they go dead. The rustling of leaves stops. The chirping of crickets is silenced. The very wind seems to hold its breath. It is a vacuum, an area of absolute negation where the world simply ceases to function. If you encounter this silence, it is not a sign of peace. It is a sign of an encroaching presence. It means that something large, something patient, and something entirely alien is currently occupying the space you are standing in. You aren't seeing him, but he is observing you, weighing your presence, and deciding whether or not you are a part of his narrative. Why do we keep telling this story? Why do we warn our children about a man who may have been a figment of a collective hallucination? Perhaps it's because, deep down, we crave the mystery. We live in a world that is overly mapped, GPS tracked, and illuminated by artificial light. We have forgotten what it feels like to be truly afraid of the dark, to recognize that there are vast swaths of this world that do not care for our names, our calendars, or our safety. The beekeeper is a reminder of our fragility. He represents the unknown, the dark corners where our logic fails and our reason dissolves. He is the embodiment of the question we are too afraid to ask. What if the world is bigger and stranger than we could ever possibly conceive? Every time you retell the story, you are adding a thread to his shroud. You are keeping the legend alive. And as long as you fear the buzzing, as long as you hesitate at the tree line, he remains. He exists in the space between your heartbeat and your fear. So, next time you are driving past that stretch of dense, ancient forest, and the shadows seem to reach a little further into the road than they did yesterday, remember the beekeeper. Don't look for him. Don't listen for the hum. Just keep driving. Because some stories are not meant to be uncovered. They are meant to stay buried in the thick, suffocating silence of the trees. The forest remembers, and for those who are brave or foolish enough to seek him out, he is always ready to add one more story to his collection. Do you hear that? The air is vibrating. It's time to leave. There is another part of the legend that is rarely told outside the valley. Most people know the story of the cabin, the impossible newspapers, and the strange buzzing that lingers in the woods long after the bees themselves have vanished. What fewer people know are the stories told by those who claim to have encountered the beekeeper and returned. The accounts are remarkably similar despite coming from different decades. Witnesses often describe becoming disoriented after wandering too far into the forest. Familiar trails suddenly seem unfamiliar. Landmarks disappear. Paths that should lead home instead loop back on themselves. Some claim they walked for hours only to find themselves standing in the exact spot where they began. At first, these experiences were dismissed as exhaustion or confusion. Dense forests have a way of distorting direction, especially when fear takes hold. Yet many who shared these stories insisted that something else was happening. They described feeling as though the woods themselves were shifting around them, quietly rearranging the landscape whenever they weren't looking. Then there are the reports of missing time. One hiker claimed he entered the forest shortly after sunrise and believed he had been walking for less than an hour. When he finally emerged, darkness had already fallen. Another reported checking his watch repeatedly during a short walk, only to discover that nearly an entire day had passed. Neither could explain where the missing hours had gone. Naturally, skeptics point out that people often lose track of time in unfamiliar environments. Stress can alter perception, and memories are far from perfect. Yet these stories continue to circulate because of the strange details attached to them. Several witnesses reported hearing the buzzing shortly before realizing time had slipped away. Not the sound of individual insects, not the sound of a hive. Something deeper, something rhythmic, a vibration that seemed to come from every direction at once. Some described it as though the forest itself was humming. Others compared it to standing near massive electrical equipment. The sound was never loud, but it carried an unnatural quality that made it impossible to ignore. It lingered beneath every other noise, hiding beneath birdsong and rustling leaves like a second heartbeat. According to local folklore, hearing the buzzing means the beekeeper has noticed you. The legend says he doesn't chase people. He doesn't need to. The forest does the work for him. As years passed, new stories emerged. Some claimed to have seen figures moving between the trees, always at the edge of visibility. Witnesses would catch a glimpse of someone standing motionless among the shadows, only for the figure to vanish when they looked directly at it. Descriptions varied, but certain details remained consistent. A wide-brimmed veil, heavy clothing, a tall silhouette that never seemed quite human. No one ever reported seeing a face. That absence became one of the most unsettling parts of the myth. The beekeeper was never given a clear appearance. The imagination was left to fill in the blanks, often creating something far more frightening than any detailed description ever could. Some storytellers believe this is intentional. They say the beekeeper appears differently to every person who encounters him. The shape remains the same, but the details shift according to the fears of the observer. In that way, the legend adapts and survives, becoming whatever is necessary to remain frightening. Perhaps that is why the story has endured for so many generations. Unlike other urban legends tied to a specific event or location, the beekeeper represents something much older and more universal: the fear of becoming lost, the fear of isolation, the fear of stepping beyond the boundaries of what is known and understood. Every culture has stories that warn people about crossing certain lines. Sometimes those warnings take the form of monsters. Sometimes they take the form of spirits or ghosts. In this valley, the warning wears a beekeeper's veil. The deeper meaning of the legend may have little to do with bees, cabins, or even time travel. Instead, it serves as a reminder that there are places in the world where certainty disappears, places where the familiar rules no longer seem reliable. The woods surrounding the valley have changed over the years. Roads have been built, new neighborhoods have appeared, trails have been mapped and marked. Yet despite all of this, the legend remains stubbornly alive. Children still hear the story. Teenagers still dare each other to search for the cabin. Adults still glance toward the tree line when the evening grows quiet, and every so often, someone claims to hear the buzzing. Most dismiss it as imagination. Others are not so sure. because the strangest thing about the beekeeper legend is not the impossible newspapers or the stories of time itself bending within the forest. It is the fact that no matter how many years pass, no matter how much the world changes, people continue to tell the same story. Perhaps that is the true mystery. Maybe the beekeeper never needed bees. Maybe he never needed a cabin. Maybe legends survive because they become part of the landscape itself, woven into the trees, the trails, and the memories of those who grow up hearing them. And if that is true, then the beekeeper may never disappear, as long as there are forests deep enough to hide secrets and people willing to wonder what might be waiting beyond the next bend in the trail. The buzzing will remain, faint, distant, almost impossible to hear, but always there.